I'd like to introduce our guest this week, who's down in sunny Somerset, and you all know how much I love Somerset. So welcome Sam Finch, who is. Are you currently? Well, whereabouts exactly? Are you sort of in between both gardens at the moment, or where are you based?
So I live closer to Bath,
Right.
so I'm slightly far away, but
Yeah.
equally wet up here as it is
Yeah.
down there.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Now, Sam, it's lovely to have you on. And I saw you. I sort of discovered you on Gardener's World, probably earlier, not earlier this year, or was it late last year? I can't remember now. There was a nice feature on you.
Yeah, I think it must have been around April this year.
Yeah, I think it
Um,
was. Yeah, yeah. And saying that you well, stating that you are the youngest head gardener in the National Trust, or for the National Trust, but not just that, you are the head gardener for two gardens in the National Trust, which is quite an achievement and quite a lot of work. So, Sam, tell us where the gardens are, if you could describe where they are, and a little bit of background about each of the gardens, because they are very special gardens and ones that I know quite well. So yeah, do tell us.
yeah, thanks, Annie. They're well, I think they're very lovely gardens. They're just going to be quite a biased 45 minutes, I'm afraid. So we're down in Somerset, which is in southwest England. I suppose the nearest sort of substantial urban area would probably be Bristol, maybe Exeter. These two gardens they're probably about 4 or 5 miles away from one another. They were both gardens created in the 20th century, the early 20th century, and developed through the rest of that period. Both of which we tend to describe them as arts and crafts inspired gardens. Um, Lytes Cary Manor was a family garden created by the Jenner family. They moved to that property in 1907 and stayed there for 41 years until the death of Walter, the patriarch of the family. It's a beautiful building that
Mm,
dates. I mean, there's been a building on that site likely for over 1,000 years, but the oldest remaining element of that building was completed in 1385, and they've stitched it on since. It's a sort of neo-Gothic, maybe Jacobean element of that architecture style.
mm,
Very, very beautiful.
mm.
A lovely backdrop for a more interesting garden.
Yeah.
Um, it's divided up into garden rooms. You often segmented by color, but similar in style.
Mhm.
And this is something that was created by the family over the course of 40 years. They weren't professional horticulturists, but they were keen amateurs, and over that time they developed space. But in contrast to that is Tintinhill Garden. So I should say the garden at Lytes Cary is currently around 4.5 acres. The garden at Tintinhill is 2.
Mhm.
Um, so Tintinhill was the house in two parts. The back, what's now the back, was a 17th century farmhouse, and then the front is a sort of 18th century Georgian facade.
Mm.
The garden, similarly to Lytes Cary, is segmented into garden rooms. However, it's quite distinct in feel once you get to know the two places. I think primarily because it was laid out and designed by professionals who had a good eye for space and scale and
Mm.
design. Harold Peto, the garden designer, had a hand in laying out the original layout, and it was then gardened by Phyllis Reese and her husband, or Phyllis Rice, sorry, and her husband. Um, they'd spent 20 years or more living down the road from Lawrence Johnston at Hidcote, which is where Phyllis developed much of her gardening style and understanding, which she then brought to Tintinhill. Looking through historic text, you'll often see Hidcote and Sissinghurst and Tintinhill referred to in the same breath,
Mm.
simply because it's a very similar style of horticulture on a different scale.
Yeah.
The 2 acres of Tintinhill and the 6 at Sissinghurst and the 10 or so at Hidcote.
Yeah.
Later on, it was then the home of Penelope Hobhouse and her then husband John Maylands. And anyone who knows of Penny's work will know that she's a knowledgeable plantswoman and
Mhm.
and a fierce character who made quite an impression on Tintinhill.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, for people, I'm sure many of you will have if you're heading west and you use the famous A303, which is the road that heads west. One garden's on one side and one garden's on the other side. So Lytes Cary's on the north side and Tintinhill's on the south side. If you're speeding on down to Cornwall, or you skidded off to go up to Bruton, then these are just a little bit further down the road, aren't they? Yeah, yeah. Um, Fantastic. So Sam, tell us how you got into horticulture. What's your training and background? What did is this what you've always done? Did you leave school and go into horticultural training?
Yeah, that was pretty much it. I came into horticulture by accident. So I started at 17. I'd done a year of A-level study and spent very little time studying and spending a lot of time having quite a good time, and then failed subsequently, rightly so. And I thought, well, I could do all of that again, or I could go and do something different. And I knew I wanted to be outside, but I knew little else. So I went to a local college, and enrolled in the horticulture course. And within a couple of weeks of starting that course, also got a job with the local design and maintenance company, working around Bath and Bristol.
Mm-hmm.
And the bug bit me, as I think it does so many people.
Mm.
And I from there, I just grew to love it, and my appetite for learning about plants and gardens and design grew from there.
Mm-hmm.
I was very lucky that the owner of the company with whom I first worked, Frank, was a very knowledgeable plantsman, quite the eccentric, as so many brilliant creatives often are, but so generous with his knowledge and understanding.
Yeah.
But from there, I worked for Frank for several years. In the interim, I did some self-employed work whilst I was studying at the level 3 RHS level 3 qualification at the Bristol Botanic Gardens. I was studying there evenings and weekends, so I could fit it around work and still pay the rent, which is a relatively intense way of doing it, but it was good. Bristol's a lovely botanic garden. It's very small. It's only 4 acres or so, but I think they've got about 5,000 species there.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, I thought, well, really, it would be useful to work for an organization like the RHS or the National Trust, partly because I had, at that time, I was thinking about going to Kew to do their 3-year diploma. And for that, you need 2 years of recognized work in a recognized garden. So I spent a year as a gardener at Prior Park, which is a landscape garden in Bath. Very beautiful. Unlike more famous ones like Stourhead, nothing's really been added to it since its decline in the late 1700s. So it's not full of Rhododendron ponticum or metasequoias or anything like that. So it's a really good example of a landscape garden. Well, I'd been there about a year, and the head gardener went on maternity leave, which for me, was fabulous timing. And I thought, well, I'll have a go. I was successful in getting the role of acting head gardener, and then I did that role for about a year, and then my current role came up, and I thought, well, they're both such lovely gardens, and as much as lovely as landscape gardens are, and as interesting as they are in their management and understanding, I was much more drawn to arts and crafts style gardening, simply because of the much greater range of plants you can grow and the opportunities for creativity and that sort of expression. For one reason or another, they gave me the job 3 years ago, and I've been having a good time ever since. I hope so.
So as a head gardener, how much gardening do you actually do, or is it largely a management job? I mean, certainly I've known National Trust head gardeners who said, "Oh, I only get out to the garden one day of the week. The rest of the time, I'm chained to my filing cabinet or whatever." I mean, how much do you actually get dirt under your fingernails?
So I do a lot. Often I'll wait for days like today, that's with torrential rain, to get lots of admin done.
Yeah.
It's a fair point though. No, it really varies from person to person and place to place. I probably spend, across both sites, I probably average 75 to 80%, maybe 70 to 80% of my time out in the garden, depending on the time of year and the strain. I go on the basis, my mantra is this a meeting or is this an email? So often things are non-horticultural tasks are drawn out. I don't go to a meeting that doesn't have an agenda, you know, and I won't stay in a meeting that's not chaired properly. I'm sure everyone on this call has been in a meeting that's not chaired properly, and it's like, you know, pulling teeth. And to be honest, I just think it's you know, it just seems a bit pointless. And then there are some non-horticultural tasks that are important and worthwhile, and all the rest of it. I think for the sake of those gardens and the team that I manage and their well-being and their development, and you know, my own enjoyment and sanity, I as much as possible, it's a good thing to get out of the garden.
And how do you split your time between the two? Is it easy to say, or is it very, very varied? How much in one and how much in another?
So currently, I'm spending 3 days a week at Lytes Cary and 2 days a week at Tintinhill. You know, it is flexible. We always I try and, you know, try different methods of working to see what's most effective and what's not. But often it can depend on the workload and the type of work going on at each property.
And how many staff or other team members in each garden? And do they dot backwards and forwards, or are they fixed?
So most of the team work across both sites.
Right.
Not every member. So we've got quite a few part-timers, but including myself, we've got the equivalent of 4 full-timers across both sites. So if you including me, essentially we've got sort of two at each garden. It doesn't quite work out that cleanly.
Right.
It's having one person managing 2 gardens is an interesting challenge. It's been very useful for me as a learning exercise, particularly in the nuance between these two, on the face of it, very, very similar gardens. But you also learn a lot about management and everything else.
Sure.
I'm not sure perhaps it's not the ideal method of management, as any gardener or head gardener will tell you. You know, doing something like this, you're managing either a living creation or what is essentially a piece of artwork, or both. And both of those things require focus, and splitting that focus, you know, waters it down for more.
And how do the 2 gardens vary from each other? Is there a very distinctive difference and feel, and also soil and all of that, you know, that kind of stuff? So how do they vary?
In the physical, Lytes Cary is a very exposed site with quite alkaline soil, whereas Tintinhill is a very sheltered site with soil it's probably around pH somewhere between 6.5 and 7. So it's the sort of acidic side of neutral, which means the range of plants we grow are quite different. In terms of feel, I would say they are different, and in terms of their significance, in terms of their historic, social, horticultural significance. It's a word that gets thrown about a lot in the trust, and no one, you know, it means 1,000 things to 1,000 people if you don't specify what you're talking about. The main difference is how they were laid out. You know, Lytes Cary was laid out by a family of amateur gardeners over the span of 40 years, whereas Tintinhill was laid out by skilled craftspeople, you know, at the same time. So from that, you get a very different. The circulation of both spaces is quite different, and the sort of types of planting are both different. But with that, you know, you get different benefits and opportunities out of those. You know, I'm less inclined to, well, I'm not really inclined at all to make changes to much of Tintinhill. You know, we can improve upon and maintain and develop the planting, but the layout, you know, it works really well. Whereas Lytes Cary, in that sense, is a much less significant garden. You know, it's listed for its sake of being old, but that's not the same thing as being significant. You know, you can tell I spend all day bent over in a border thinking about gardens. But Lytes Cary, in my view, is there's much more scope for reasonable development, because so many of the things that are considered significant have been implemented by the National Trust themselves. For example, planting plans by Graham Stewart Thomas, who we were talking about earlier. So it's on the, you know, when you spend all day in both of them, you do get a real feel for their nuances and their niches.
So you were talking about developing the gardens, and that's always an interesting one in terms of how much innovation and new planting you can do. I know at times the trust have been quite keen on, you know, keeping original plantings. I remember actually when Penelope Hobhouse was at Tintinhill, she actually had a certain amount of conflict with the trust over new things that she wanted to plant and was sort of having to sort of hide them, I mean, that must be something that must be changing. I mean, particularly in view of climate change. So, really, how much? What I'm asking is really, how much freedom of action do you have for new planting?
We at both these sites we have a relative free reign compared to other trust properties at least. So every region will have at least one garden consultant employed by the National Trust. My garden consultant is Alan Power, who was the head gardener at Stanley for a long time.
Oh.
Alan and I get on really well. We view horticulture, I think, in a similar way and have a shared, we're both sort of slightly obsessive people when it comes to plant identification and that sort of thing. But I think partly because of that good relationship, and partly because of that similar worldview, he's confident in my ability to work in an effective way. I think maybe that will change one day, but for now, it's certainly we have a relative freedom. It also depends on the significance of both those of the garden you're working in and of the level of information on it. Somewhere like Biddulph Grange in the northeast is a grade 1 listed garden that has to the almost to the millimeter the exact planting plans that were laid out by the original family. Whereas at Lytes Cary, we have it's a grade 2 listed garden. Secondly, there was no notable designer or horticulturalist there at any real point. But also, we don't have any information. We've got a handful of historic photographs from 1948 from a Country Life article, but other than that, we've got very little. So we have a sort of the National Trust call it a spirit of place, an understanding of the sort of context within which the garden was developed. For example, the Jenners grew lots of roses and they segmented the area into garden rooms. Beyond that, there's it's difficult to provide parameters when there's no information on the history of the place. It also often depends on, I think, on your manager. So myself, as nearly all head gardeners within the trust are not managed by other horticulturists. They're usually managed by general managers or property managers, which in itself adds a different dynamic. If you've got a slightly more overbearing manager, then they might start to interfere a bit more, which I'm sure can cause all manner of...
I'm sure you haven't got an overbearing
manager. No. My manager's very, very lovely. We get on well,
yes,
and she's very supportive, which again helps. And I also think there's don't know whether I should say this or not, there's an element of asking forgiveness, not permission. Some an organization as large and occasionally unwieldy as the National Trust comes with its own level of bureaucracy. For example, we're currently rebuilding the compost facilities at Tintinhill ourselves. That's often the convention is that we get contractors to do it, but that costs an enormous amount of money and takes a lot of time. And our compost bays are falling apart, and we need to repair them. In the same way, we've implemented at Tintinhill an irrigation system within particularly the kitchen garden that we've now extended to the rest of the garden, using water tanks that capture rainwater, and led by our senior gardener Alex. This irrigation system is now entirely automated. So we've saved ourselves loads of time, but we've done it ourselves, so it saved massive amounts of money and time compared to getting contractors to do it. Whereas the second that we started thinking about this, we had members of other departments immediately saying, "Oh well, you need to get this contractor in or that contractor in, and you must have these preliminary planning meetings in place and all the rest of it." Yeah. And sometimes I think just using, we've got a diverse team of people with various interesting personal and professional backgrounds that all come with their own array of skills. And I think sometimes just being slightly pragmatic and getting on with things and demonstrating something when it's finished, saying, "Look at this lovely product, doesn't it work so well?" is I think maybe a slightly cheeky way of getting a lot done, but it's certainly more efficient than convention.
How many staff do you have actually?
So we've got we've got quite a lot of part-timers, but including myself, we've got the equivalent of 4 full-time members of staff split across both sites.
And the images that we're looking at the moment are a mixture of both gardens, or is it just Tintinhill?
So we've got a mixture of both. The one on
Mixture,
screen,
yeah.
the one on screen at the moment is it's a lovely example of it's Clerodendron Trichotopus bargesii at Tintinhill. We've now shifted to the long border at Lytes Cary Manor.
Right. Yeah.
But it's a fair point, though, Annie, is that they're certainly quite similar gardens in style on the face of it.
Yeah, I mean, I could see when the photographs include a building, I recognise Lytes Cary. I mean, I didn't realise that Lytes Cary was a 20th century garden, because, of course, when you approach it and you've got those wonderfully iconic clipped yew topiary forms that are so those were created by the family in the 20th century. So before the garden that we see now at Lytes Cary, what was there before? Was it just pasture, or what do you know what was there before?
We have a reasonable idea of what was there before. So the house gets its name partly from the Cary River, which runs through that part of Somerset, partly from the Lytes family. They lived there from the 1200s in whatever form that building was in. I believe it was William Lyte I, who was then the Sheriff of Somerset, who was given that estate by I don't know the name of whichever feudal lord was running that part of the country, because he came in his good graces. The most significant member of the Lytes family, certainly from a horticultural perspective, was Henry Lyte, who wrote a botanical text in the 1500s called the New Herbal. That was a translation of I think a Flemish text.
According to Graham Stuart Thomas, he translated Delacluze's French edition of the Krauter book of the Dutch chap. So it was like two translations along. The new herbal or history of plants, which was a very significant herbal at the time. So that was 1578. So
absolutely. So the annotated, Graham Stuart Thomas saying it there far more eloquently than I could. The original annotated copy of that, I believe, is in the British Museum. There's one of the original copies in the house, of which the house team are very protective. But as you say, no, it was a botanical. It was functionally it was an apothecary text. And if there were any gardens at the time, they would have likely been apothecary gardens surrounded by orchards. So the estate owned by the National Trust at Lytes Cary is currently 369 acres. But in the time of Henry Lyte, it was close to 5,000. So it was a much bigger space.
And are either of the houses inhabited?
No, both of the houses have elements that are rented out for holiday lets. So you can rent out most of the house at Tintinhill and the west wing of the house at Lytes Cary. Right. But the rest of the house at Lytes Cary is open to the public, the older elements of it. It's a very impressive. The Great Hall is itself particularly impressive. I'm never that one for houses particularly, other than for growing plants up, but that is it's a nice.
It's very, very beautiful, isn't it? It's very beautiful. And what in both gardens, what would you say your greatest challenges are with each garden? I'm sure they're probably different, but what are the things that pose the most problems, or just the biggest challenges for you?
I mean, certainly the biggest challenge coming in was the impact of COVID-19 and the various lockdowns. So I started this job at the end of 2021. And for the last 3 years, myself and the team have been focusing on just bringing the standards back up. I think we're there at Tintinhill. We're nearly there at Lytes Cary. I think after some additional works this winter, we'll be at a good base level. It's a good question. I think I try and view these things frame it in a positive way, partly because it makes work more enjoyable, but also then I find that you get better results. Being in as I understand it, certainly so much of being a head gardener is creative problem solving. So for instance, you could say at Lytes Cary it's very cold over the winter. Certainly for the southwest of England anyway. I came in one December morning last year, or possibly the year before, and it was -13 at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, I remember that bit before Christmas when it was really, really, really cold. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Whereas you go to Tintinhill on the same day, and it was -3, I think.
Yeah,
So it showed the disparity in those spaces.
yeah.
Lytes Cary, the soil is very thin, so we
Right.
get a foot of clay or clay loam in the borders as it is now, as having worked, and then you get straight to the lias bedrock. So it's very, very free draining, and particularly not this summer, but last summer and the year before, when it was very, very hot and dry, that poses issues of keeping plants alive. And in the long term, there's a lot of talk within organisations such as English Heritage and the National Trust about, oh, well, as we get hotter, drier summers, we'll simply replace the planting styles we have with species from the Mediterranean and North Africa. But firstly, that kind of defeats the point of having an historic garden. If you had a fire in the house and all the wood panelling went, you wouldn't replace it with glittery wallpaper.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's short-sighted. In somewhere in the southwest that has such wet winters, if you plant lots of North African plants, they'll die in the winter anyway.
Exactly.
But on the flip side of that, it forces us to look for solutions. So, for example, Lytes Cary in the 1970s, a swimming pool was put into the garden, and we're now in the process of turning that swimming pool into a means of rainwater storage by capturing rainwater from the manor house.
Right.
And then we can irrigate the gardens through the summer with rainwater.
Right.
So it's I think by how you frame these issues can contribute to how you can deal with them and approach them. I've spent time being overwhelmed by things, but now I just try and think, well, how can we do something interesting? How can we develop this?
Yeah. And I know Penny Hobhouse is getting on now, but does she ever pop into Tintinhill? Does she ever come and see or not?
I've been to see her. I don't think she's often not quite able or in the best way to come and visit.
Yeah.
But it's always interesting to talk to her. Even now, but I think she's 92, maybe or 93.
Yeah.
She's still a force of nature.
Yeah.
Very knowledgeable, very direct person. But as you were saying about, I think, Noel, you were saying about challenges of restriction within the trust. Penny's told a great story of when she was there. Her and John, her husband, John Malins, grew Tibucina oviliana, which is a beautiful flowering from South America, lovely purple flowers. But she knew that John Sayles, the head of gardens at the time, wouldn't like it. So whenever she knew that John Sayles was coming, her and her husband would move these Tibucinas around to the back of the greenhouses where they're out of the way. So now we like growing Tibucinas because they tell that story to.
That's great. That's great. I think there were quite a few things I think she had to hide or sort of temporarily conceal. On the subject of trust policy, I mean, it's one of those things. Everyone in gardening has a view on National Trust gardens. Certainly, my view several years ago was that I felt that a lot of trust gardens were kind of over-maintained. I had a conversation with a head gardener at an unnamed Southern English private garden a few days ago, who was sort of saying, "Oh, National Trust gardens are going downhill." And I said, "Well, actually, maybe there's another explanation here. Maybe they're loosening up. Maybe there's a biodiversity agenda." I'm just thinking of how RHS Wisley has really loosened up over the last few years. So a lot of gardens are adopting a looser aesthetic, recognizing that it's not totally necessary to keep everything so kind of trimmed in the way that it used to be. That there are big biodiversity benefits to this. What's the current sort of to use that ghastly political phrase, party line on this that's coming down from the powers that be in the trust?
So there's a lot of as we say now, there's a lot of talk, rightly so, around biodiversity and environmental consciousness. Something that I'm acutely aware of, I think, simply by virtue of my age as much as anything else. I'm 26 for context. I keep being told I should moisturize by my lovely fiance because the weather's taking its toll.
Sunscreen,
Yeah,
sunscreen.
exactly. Um, yeah, so the on something like the use of glyphosate, for example, which is usually sold as Roundup, the chemical weed killer, the synthetic weed killer, I should say. Um, Again, the use of the language chemicals is a personal bugbear. It's a sort of meaningless phrase. But the use of glyphosate, the National Trust recommend you shouldn't use it. They don't. There's no rule. Like, no one would be disciplined for using it. I have stopped using it myself, and the team don't use it at either site now, including we're trialing this year not using it in the car park at Lytes Cary, which is a sort of stone car park in which weeds germinate well. But again, it goes back to the whole aspect of, dealing with problems. Problems can produce interesting solutions. So we find that in that car park, we mostly get weeds along the edges of the car park where cars aren't driving. So we're trialing different plants to grow there to outcompete what are considered to be weeds. We're growing things like creeping thyme. We've got Erigeron carvinscianus. We've got even things like Stachys byzantina or Cicericium, things that aren't groundbreakingly interesting botanical curiosities, but they're nice things.
Yeah,
and they can brighten up a car park. But in terms of biodiversity, again, we're quite lucky on that basis, is that it's very easy for us to lean into sort of, densely planted borders and allowing sort of, for example, over the winter, we don't cut down anything herbaceous until March, partly to provide habitat, but also because we open in February, and otherwise there's little to see in the borders. But because of our, it's not a sort of, it's not a Baroque garden, it's not a Victorian garden full of very neat rows of bedding plants. They're mostly mixed or herbaceous borders that are intended to be quite sort of full and billowing. So I think it's easy for us to lean into that.
And what are your visitor numbers for both gardens? Are they roughly equal because people can do them both very, very easily because they're so close? Is one more visited than the other?
So Lytes Cary gets more visitors. At the moment, we're roughly around 75,000 people a year at Lytes Cary and about 25,000 at Tintinhill. That's mostly because Lytes Cary has a larger and more robust car park. We can create as beautiful a garden as we like, but so often it's down to the practicalities of the area.
Yeah.
You can be as artistic and creative as you like, but it's so often dictated by the bottom line.
Yeah.
But it's a good amount. I like working with the public. Most of the time, I like working with the public.
Yeah. I noticed in one of the photographs there's a glass house. Is that at Tintinhill, the propagation area?
So that one's at Lytes Cary Manor.
Oh, Lytes Cary. Yeah.
So we've got a similar setup at both sites. We've got 2 or 3 greenhouses. At Lytes Cary, we've also got a polytunnel and a shade tunnel.
Yeah.
And an increasing nursery area just full of interesting things that we take out of the garden that are worth propagating or having spares of.
Yeah. And do you ever have a chance as a head gardener for the National Trust, do you ever get a chance to get together with other head gardeners from the National Trust? Is there a meeting or a forum, or do you opportunities to do that and sort of swap thoughts, ideas and things?
Yeah, we're doing something along that lines next Tuesday at Montacute, just down the road.
Yeah.
I'm very keen on that sort of thing. I think it's something that gardeners are often, I don't know if reluctance is the right word, but we're so often having a lovely time in our own gardens. We don't often think of it. But it's so valuable to spend time with other gardeners. And I think, particularly in the Trust, an organisation with 220 something gardens and parklands, it's such a unique opportunity to engage with other people doing things.
And
so, for example,
you feel that support and camaraderie, don't you, with each other as well?
Yeah, very much so. So I helped to run the one of the lead gardener groups for the Southwest. So once a quarter, we all the head gardeners and senior gardeners of the area meet up to do just that, discuss contemporary issues or possible areas of shared working, or training opportunities. And then once a year, we have gardeners of every level in that region come together for the same thing. But it's also just a way to share any interesting observations or learnings or gripes with people in the same position.
Sure. In fact, Andrew Bunting, who works for the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, I think he's vice president, when he was a young whippersnapper gardener, he spent time working at Tintinhill with Penny Hobhouse and has
Great.
lots of stories. Yeah, he really enjoyed it and tells stories of taking plants up to Scotland in a van to a project that she was doing up there, and has very fond memories of it, which is rather lovely. We've got quite a few questions coming in, actually. There was a photograph of a pale pink plant underneath a leaded window. It looked like a vetch of some type. Can you remember what it is? It might come up.
It's it's a form of the perennial sweet pea. It's
Oh, right. So it's a lathyrus, is it?
It is.
Yeah,
It's
right.
not.
Okay.
Pink as well. Spectacular, wasn't it?
Yeah. When it comes
It's
back
really
up.
nice.
Yeah.
We're saving seed from it this year to see if hopefully we'll get something comparable.
Yes. Oh,
You can
good.
have
Good.
I can never remember. It's not odoratus. It's the everlasting pea,
No.
whose
Right.
proper
Right.
name
Okay.
but a lovely thing.
Yeah, super. We've got a comment from Anne Cale, who's a member of the Somerset Gardens Trust, and she says that Sam asked to meet with us to see if we could give him any more historical knowledge on and information on either of the gardens. His knowledge and ability is amazing, and we're very pleased that he's in Somerset and that these two important gardens in the county are in his care. So that's really nice.
That's very generous.
Well, I'm sure it's very true.
And then we've got a
Jenny
question from
Nelson
Jenny
is
Nelson about volunteers, because I was going to ask about volunteers. And
yeah.
Jenny is specifically saying, do you offer training opportunities for volunteers as Great Dixter does? But I mean, volunteers, and the Trust have been taking on volunteers now for quite a few years. I mean, it's been an important part of the strategy. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the volunteers you have and how you work with them.
So at each site, we have volunteers in 3 days a week. We usually have a team of between 4 and 6, occasionally 7 volunteers on a day. And different volunteers have different interests and different levels of knowledge and ability. A lot of the majority of our volunteers are retirees who have either a passion for horticulture or an interest in the outdoors, or occasionally have a spouse who'd quite like to get them out of the house slightly more often. All of whom are lovely and valuable members of the team. Sometimes we have often volunteers who come and spend time with us sometimes they'll only spend time with us for a day or a few days over a few weeks, who are younger and interested in coming into horticulture as a career. I think simply by some mild exposure and the fact that I'm also young, I've had some young people reach out and say they want to come and spend time, which has been very gratifying, really lovely.
Yeah.
It's a valuable. The volunteers of the National Trust are a valuable member of our teams.
Yeah. But is it your job to manage and work out schedules and all that sort of thing? Because I know that can be really time consuming for head gardeners. Is that part of your remit?
It is. You can finesse it to a degree, but I think the way to stop it from consuming lots of time is to just be quite laid back with it. If people don't, sometimes you get a day with 5 people, and sometimes you get a day with 1 person.
Right,
and I think having the flexibility to deal with that is a good thing.
Yeah. And you were saying that the gardens open in April and close at the end of October. Is that right?
So Lytes Cary opens from usually the start of February to the end of November.
Oh, right.
And Tintinhill opens at the start of April and closes at the start of October.
Oh, right. Okay. So shorter time. Okay. Yeah.
Just wondering, in terms of the status of gardens within the National Trust, I mean, the National Trust has this extraordinary and absolutely unique portfolio of relatively wild spaces, the stately homes, the gardens, and all the rest of it. And really, I think for most of us, certainly the last few decades, the Trust has largely been about the houses, but there's gardens definitely seem to have been creeping up the agenda. And I remember talking to the Mike Calner when he was National Gardens Advisor, which must have been probably 20 years ago, actually, saying, oh well, the gardens are, we're getting more and more visitors because you go to a stately home and you think, well, yeah, that's going to be the same if you go next year. But if you go to a garden is always different, and there was definitely a feeling that gardens were going up the agenda, but I never seem to get the message that that's necessarily reflected in the share out of resources. I mean, do you feel how do you feel about the status of gardens within the trust, both in terms of perhaps the amount of professional attention you get or resourcing?
Yeah, I think as any gardener, will always say that gardens need more attention than they get simply by virtue of, our own, the nature of our job. I think it's even if you're a person working within the trust who has no interest in any type of conservation, and in your remit is simply to get people through the door, you should focus on gardens, because you can go to a house once, and as you say, you go to a house once, it can be very beautiful and very inspiring, but you go back again, you may be inspired in a different way, but nothing materially will have changed.
Yeah,
Whereas
the same pictures of the family on the same places on the walls, aren't they?
Exactly. I mean, some of those pictures might have been restored or been moved or whatever. But you go to a garden, particularly with gardens such as Lytes Cary and Tintinhill, with the capacity for a certain amount of development and change.
Yeah.
And not only is it different in every season or in every week, but every day. Sometimes, you get to June, July, every single day there's a different thing to see or something else to experience. And then you get the compounding impact of developments on a year-by-year basis, and improvements. For example, at Lytes Cary, there was in one area of the garden that's now a lawn, there was an Edwardian rose garden, and we plan in a few years' time to bring that back. You're not going to go to a house and suddenly find a conservatory on the back that wasn't there 5 years ago.
Right.
You know what I mean? So you have all this
Yeah.
potential for growth. So I think for that reason, if no other, gardens should have the lion's share of the attention. But I also think that gardens are unique within the trust, because they are certainly within the domestic context of houses and things like that. No one sleeps in the beds. No one eats dinner at the dining room. But people still walk through the garden, and
that's interesting.
and they experience it, and they can play croquet on the lawn, or they can, they can smell the roses, or they can sit down and have difficult conversations with loved ones or see old friends. Gardens are used now in this exactly the same way as they were used 100, 200, 300 years ago. I sometimes think that perhaps not enough is made of that. And the fact that people are crying out for green space, in all walks of life, people want somewhere that's beautiful and inspiring and can get in touch with nature.
I'm sure years ago, Sam, I came to a plant fair at Lytes Cary a long time ago now, pretty long. So do you at either of the gardens have any events or plant fairs, or any, are you pressured to do any, events to raise funds and things? So what, does that happen or not?
Yes, so we don't have, at the moment, we don't have much in the way of horticultural events. I'm keen to steer them back in that direction. I think so much of this was, COVID shook up so many things, and right, you understandably changed so many dynamics. I think the plant fairs are a great idea. I think it appeals to much of our core audience, these two gardens. But I also think there's capacity for garden workshops. For example, we have several meadows at Lytes Cary. We could run scything workshops. I think there'd be interest in that, and it would help us. We have more people on the ground helping us do some fairly intensive work. But so much of that is I don't wish to say above my pay grade, but those decisions are made above me, certainly.
Sure.
And I think that at a certain point, we can continue to feed into those discussions. But I think there's also value in the acceptance of knowing what is within the agreement and what's not, because you can drive yourself mad trying to change.
Well, I think we've gone through all the questions and comments, Sam. So I'm very aware that you've got a very busy week ahead of you, with rather a special day happening on Saturday because you're getting married, which is fantastic. So I don't want us to take up too much of your time, but I hope everything goes tremendously well. And are you going to have a nice week off, honeymoon somewhere afterwards, or are you back in the garden? What's going to happen?
They were having a lovely week in Paris,
Wait, oh, how
which is
romantic.
absolutely, it's where we got engaged.
Not possibly
Yeah,
not looking at gardens.
probably not. No,
Oh,
it's something of a busman's holiday. I think that would be.
no, that's lovely. That's lovely. Oh, well, Sam, it's been fantastic having you on. Thank you for
Great, yes,
making
been
the time.
marvelous. Yes,
And
No
yes,
I'm
worries.
sure
It's
you,
been an absolute pleasure.
yeah, and I will definitely come and see you
yes, ditto.
one of my
Yes,
West Country jaunts,
yeah.
and
No,
maybe we'll knock on your door about possibility of doing a garden masterclass event at one of these places,
oh,
perhaps.
there's a thought. Yes,
Hmm.
yes.
I would be more than happy to oblige.
Oh, lovely,
Great,
Sam. Well,
marvelous.
listen, have a fantastic wedding. Enjoy the day, and thank you so much. It's been great, and yeah, carry on with the good work.
Thank you both very much.
That's all right. Okay, take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Take care. Bye bye.